Just have some introductory things. Welcome. I'm Amy Durrell, and I know we're a few minutes early, but I thought we'd just kind of start a little bit informally. I've got some questions for you guys, so I thought we'd start with that. I'm a proud graduate of Georgia State. I finished, what year was it? I got screwed up by COVID. I think it was 2022. I graduated with a master's from the MHP program, the Master's in Historic Preservation. And so I'm trained as a historian. My focus is public history. And my interest is really Atlanta history and Southern history. And I have a company called History Afoot Atlanta, and I do walking tours of the city. So there's a way in which kind of the city is my classroom. And I love to take locals and visitors out and talk about what we see and what does that tell us about Atlanta. And I'm really privileged because I have some professors here at Georgia State who invite me to come and do a walk with their students. And I've really enjoyed doing that. And that's helped me have an opportunity to see how Georgia State students are looking at our city. And that's some of how I connected with these folks. So we have 3 different Georgia State students: graduate students, current students, past students, undergraduates. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to start you out giving you a little bit of history, and history kind of specifically focused on Atlanta as an international city. And I'm kind of putting a question mark on that. But I want to start by asking folks, if you wouldn't mind, I'm curious, I want to get a sense of how long folks have been here. So how many, I'm going to ask kind of a series of questions. Raise your hand. How many people have lived in the greater metro area more than 2 years? All right. How many people have lived here more than 10 years? More than 20 years? Okay. I'm impressed. How many people have family roots here? Maybe your parents were born here. You've lived here that long. Anybody? There we go. Thank you. So my daughter is 31. She tells me, she lives here in the metro area. She tells me that people sometimes call her a unicorn because she's so rare that she was born here. I moved to Atlanta in 1986, and I actually worked across the street in the Candler building when it was still an office building. And so I used to park where this building is now. And I was always fascinated by the city. And that's kind of what began my journey of trying to learn about this new place I had adopted. Now I want to jump back and ask one more question. How many people in the room have at some point in their life lived abroad? Right, so a lot of folks have, yeah. So I wanted to go back and look at Atlanta history and think about specifically Atlanta as an international city. So if you came to Atlanta in 1850, maybe some folks don't realize, Atlanta was basically settled in 1837 because we were building railroads and this was going to be a railroad town. So by 1850, the city had a small population, a lot of people who were building railroads. Does anybody have any idea, if we walked around Atlanta in 1850, what languages we might hear or accents we might hear? Anybody want to offer an idea? Excuse me? A Southern accent, yes. Yep. Yes. We had a lot of enslaved laborers living here. They tended to be young men because they were doing physical labor. So they probably were born here in the United States, but their language was probably influenced by African traditions. You wouldn't have heard a lot of foreign languages. The South didn't attract a lot of foreign workers. You would have heard Irish accents. We had a lot of Irish laborers who came here who were largely displaced because there was cheaper enslaved labor. And so they lost their jobs working on the railroad. And many of them settled and became farmers and things here. And then I love this detail. A writer named Mark Pfeiffer, P-I-F-E-R, identified a woman named Mahala Siago in the public record in the 1850s. And he identified her name as a traditional Creek or Muskogee name. So this area was where the Creek or Muskogee people lived. And what we would find is there were a certain number, they had largely been displaced, but there were a certain number of people who had opted to stay here. And so we can remember that tradition and that she would have had that language as well. So we do see some variety. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of census data, and then I'm going to turn it over to our students who are going to talk about what they see in Atlanta and what that means. So if we came to Atlanta in 1880, there was a population of about 37,000 people. Of that population, in the census data, they recorded, the question is, were you foreign born? So 5.9% of our Atlanta population was foreign born in 1880. In 1900, that number had dropped to 2.8%. And in fact, 77% of the people in the city of Atlanta were born right here in the state of Georgia. And so what we have is a lot of movement from people who were born in farms and rural areas coming into the city. And this is that very common historical, we talk about industrialization. And what was happening in Georgia is cotton didn't make as much money, mainly because there was a worldwide market and more countries were growing cotton. And so prices, there was more competition, prices dropped. And then the other thing that was happening in Georgia is the boll weevil, a little tiny bug, was attacking cotton. So working on living on a farm was no longer as good an option, and people were moving to Atlanta to take new jobs in Atlanta manufacturing facilities. 1900, so 1900 is 2.8, and then in 1940 and 1950, the number of foreign born in Atlanta dropped to 1.4%. And what we're seeing in that 1900 to 1950 time period is the way in which the South was very isolated. It was separate from mainstream America. It was missing the growth. It was much more poorer than the rest of America. And we didn't have a lot of immigration. And to remind you, in 1900, in New York City, 25% of people were foreign born. So there's a way in which we celebrate that kind of immigration story in America in the beginning of the 20th century, and that just didn't happen in the Southeast. In 2000, we start to see a change, 10%, and in this case, I looked at Metro Atlanta, 10% of Metro Atlanta, and also 10% of Atlanta. Both cases, the number was the same, were foreign born. So this represented a real change, and it was a change from when I came in 1986. By 2020, interestingly, only 8.8% if you look at the city proper, over 14% in the larger city. So we see this change historically in Atlanta to becoming a much more international city, a much greater presence of people from all over the world. But I wanted you to understand, and because we're going to look at monuments from different points of the time, as we think about placemaking and what does our city tell us, we'll see the monuments reflect the kind of population that was living here. Yes. Yes. Correct. That would be within the city of Atlanta. Just Atlanta. If there were indigenous people here, they would have been included, but largely they had been encouraged or forced to leave. So the history is there was the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee people. Excuse me? Correct. This was from the U.S. Census, so everyone who was here was counted. But by 1880, if you were indigenous, you were probably hiding that because it generally wasn't accepted for them to still be here. They had mostly been forced to leave in the 1830s. Yes. Mm-hmm. Correct. Well, I will confess, I've looked for research to understand sort of Atlanta as an international community, 1920 and earlier, and people don't look at it very much. And I think when we look at the Black tradition, we see some of that internationalism, but that largely wasn't celebrated. And so what I do know is, so in, I believe it was 1850, I think we had 473 free Black people living in Atlanta. So it was a much smaller percentage. And of course, officially, enslavement, importing enslaved people had ended. I've forgotten the exact year, but so most Black folks who lived here by 1850 were born within the United States. And what I know about Black language traditions is that there were different kind of Black language traditions in different parts. The Gullah tradition, of course, along the coast was one of the places where that Black accent was preserved the most. What you would have seen in Atlanta specifically, I believe, would have been enslaved people coming from all over the place. So I would suspect there wasn't a strong language tradition that was consistent among them. Does that make sense and answer your question? Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there is any documentation. In the 1850 census, which I didn't look at for this, enslaved people are listed separately, and I believe it's on, I can't remember, it's just their first name and last name, their sex, and their age. So there's very, very limited information. The question of were they foreign born is not included in the 1850 census at all. And it's a difficult census to look at because it's all handwritten, so that's part of why I'd started at 1880. I hope that answers your question, and I'm happy to talk to you some more. Yes? Yes, and the Jewish community was coming to Atlanta, I think really starting in kind of the 1880s, and we start to see a rise in that. And by 1900, there was a significant Jewish presence. A lot of them were coming from the Northeast, actually, down here. That's a kind of a complicated story that I'll confess I didn't try to get into today. So I'd like to turn it over to our students and graduates. And what I'd like to do, if you all don't mind, is hold questions till the end so we'll have time for all students to answer questions. And you kind of have the big picture of what they're going to share with you. So if that's okay, we're going to move on to Eris. This is Eris Weiss, who's a current senior about to graduate. And I'll let her share her story.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. As she said, I'm a current senior. I'm majoring in environmental science, which is a little bit of a departure from what we're talking about today. But I personally have an interest in urban studies and its connection to placemaking, so that's how I feel like I'm fit in with this topic. So I want to open with a quote. This is from a study on women in public spaces that was featured in Cities, volume 154, this past November. And the quote reads, "Women are more sensitive to the availability of playground equipment, recreational areas, shaded areas and drinking fountains, to pleasant views, and to the health benefits of green spaces, landscape, and environment." So I just want to move it over to this idea of, yes, I'm going to be talking about the history and the background of the figures that are being represented in these monuments that I'm talking about, but I also want us to keep in the back of our mind that these are monuments that people have to look at and engage with, particularly pedestrians. So they're going to have feelings about this, and this really changes the way that they interact with the space. So my first statue that I'm going to be talking about is the Henry Grady statue. In 1891, 2 years after Henry Grady's sudden death, the statue was unveiled on the corner of Marietta Street and Forsyth Street to an audience of about 25,000 onlookers. At the time of its erection, it was adjacent to the U.S. Post Office and Customs building. And at this time, or soon after this time, the building will be used for the Atlanta City Hall. So that's significant of it. That's the significance of that building. So Henry Grady himself was a significant figure in the South for his connection to helping reintegrate the recently defeated Confederacy back into the Union after their defeat in the Civil War. And he did so through a concept called the New South, where he published a paper, an editorial, in the Atlanta Daily Herald, and it kind of took off, and people started to adopt that kind of thinking of the South being changed after the Civil War. And he continued to speak about this in various speeches across the country, as well as publications to the Atlanta Constitution, where he was trying to elicit economic support from the North after the South's defeat in the Civil War. So the statue itself poses him on top of a podium above two women. These two women are meant to represent virtues, one representing history and the other one representing memory. However, they are depicted with a meek demeanor. They're looking down toward the street, and they have a very dejected expression on their face. So it has to be representative of the view of women at that time. At this point, it was the late 1800s. And these women themselves are not actually representations of a real woman that existed. They're this personification of virtues, concepts. So it can only be reflective of the view of women. Henry Grady himself is standing high on this podium, high above the women, also high above street level. He has an emotionless expression, kind of giving off this air of a strong white male figure, and he's looking down at the street. The portrayal of him as well as the portrayal of the women below him all come together to culminate in this kind of idea of this idol worship of Henry Grady as a figure. And this kind of conclusion is supported in when we look at the usage of the public space about 15 years after the erection of the statue. So in 1906, in the racial and violence that ensued in Atlanta, on September 22nd, among the dozen plus Black people that were murdered that day, the bodies of two Black men who were murdered in the barbershop across from the post office, as well as the body of another Black man murdered a short distance nearby, were dragged and heaped to the base of this statue. And it almost evokes this image of the white mob delivering these Black bodies of the people that they murdered to Henry Grady himself, which kind of sheds a light to how he was viewed by white Atlantans at that point. He was, if not a figure of white supremacy, he was at least viewed as adjacent or in support of white supremacy. And he was known to be a supporter of segregation, although not a supporter of slavery. But that seems to be more so a political stance from him to reintegrate the South and elicit some type of sympathy from the North after they lost the war. And so when we think of how this violence came to be, it was perpetuated by the media and the newspapers at the time, where they went and they published these unsubstantiated reports about Black men sexually assaulting white women, which helped to elicit this violence. But then once the violence happened, they did very little to condemn what had occurred, and actually in the years to come helped suppress the event from the memory of Atlantans. And to this day, there is no placard or inscription that acknowledges the travesty that occurred on this location. And my next statue is the Barbara Miller Asher statue. So this statue was first unveiled in 1998, 3 years after her death in 1995. It stands in front of Broad Street Plaza on Marietta Street. It's about a few blocks away from the Centennial Olympic Park and just 1 block down from the Henry Grady statue. Barbara Miller Asher was a figure of Atlanta politics. Shortly after moving to Atlanta after finishing college, she decided that she wanted to enrich herself in the culture of Atlanta and become involved in the community. So she got a job working at Rich's department store, or one of the Rich's department store locations. And the Rich's department chain was a very legendary department chain that serviced the South, and particularly Atlanta and Georgia, from 1867 until its dissolution in 2005 to Macy's. And in addition to this, soon after, she decided to start volunteering with the National Council of Jewish Women. And within 2 years of volunteering with them, she became their vice president. And she came to have 14 years of volunteer work under her belt before she actually went on to run for public office. And before she ran for public office in 1974, she was appointed to the Zoning Review Board by Maynard Jackson. And she worked there until she ran for public office 3 years later. And when she ran for Atlanta City Council, she ended up winning, and she became the second woman in Atlanta to sit on the Atlanta City Council, and ended up going for 2 more terms and served 3 terms in total. She is credited as being pretty important for bringing the Olympics to Atlanta, although her contribution to that event is not very well documented. The statue itself depicts her standing, looking slightly upward with a smile on her face, holding a paper that reads Blueprint for the City of Atlanta, which is likely a reference to when she worked on the Zoning Review Board. Now, she's not standing fully upright. She has her legs slightly bent. And considering the proximity to the Henry Grady statue, it's pretty impossible not to compare this statue to the depiction of particularly the women in the Henry Grady statue. There are some notable improvements in the way that the women are depicted. They're initially depicted as meek in the Henry Grady statue, and this statue came to be over a century later. And she's not depicted quite as meek. She has a brightness to her, and she has an inviting stance, but it does beg the question of, did this come to be because that is how women had to portray themselves in order to make achievements in their career? And Barbara Miller Asher, as a person, as a representation of a person, the statue has to be in some way a reflection of her accomplishments. So this inviting stance can be attributed to how she had to behave in public, in the public sphere. So when she was first volunteering, later she noted that she felt compelled to agree to opportunities that she wasn't very interested in because she wanted to make small strides for women in the Jewish community. And she also noted that when she first floated the idea of running for Atlanta City Council in 1977 at a Pinky Bradley Miller fundraising breakfast, most of the people at the breakfast laughed and disregarded her. So with her being a public figure and a woman at this time, over 50 years ago, it really goes to show that women were marked by their gender before they were marked by their accomplishments, especially in their portrayal. My next statue is the Zernona Clayton statue. This statue stands in Hardy Ivy Park in what is now known as the Zernona Clayton Plaza. It was unveiled just 2 years ago in 2023. Zernona Clayton is a civil rights leader. She was known for working pretty closely with Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. After connecting with them through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and she became very close friends, particularly with Coretta Scott King. And she was noted for being the first Black woman to ever have a primetime television talk show. And she's also pretty well known for influencing a Grand Dragon of the KKK to step down from his role and resign. And he credited her and their talks when they worked together on the Model Cities program, which was founded by Lyndon B. Johnson, where they would frequently get into daily debates about race and society at large. In 1991, she released her autobiography, I've Been Marching All the Time, which is in part what was a response to criticisms that she received about not being on the front lines of the civil rights movement, speculated being due to her being afraid of being arrested. Now, the statue itself does not suffer from the same issues that the other two statues before suffer from, as far as their depiction of women. She does have that bright, inviting stance that Barbara Miller Asher has. She has a smile on her face. However, something about her body language has more so of a commanding presence. She's holding her arms outright, and she's looking outward and not up and not looking away and diverting her attention the way that both the women in the Henry Grady statue as well as Barbara Miller Asher were. So she herself has like this commanding, authoritative position, and she always has in her life, where she isn't somebody who's afraid to back down, and this reflects her pretty well. Also, of the three statues, she is the only figure who is still alive for their commemoration, and she actually worked pretty closely with the sculptor in order to make this image come to life. She said that she sent him over 300 pictures of herself that they were in contention for, and they jointly decided on the same picture together, being this one, to come to life for this statue. Also, being inside of Hardy Ivy Park, it's in the center of a pocket park, which makes it much more accessible to pedestrians, whereas both the Barbara Miller Asher and the Henry Grady statue are on Marietta Street in between the roads on both sides, so they are only accessible by a crosswalk. So if somebody were to want to go up and read the inscription or interact with the statues in some way, they can't do that. But it's so much easier for the Zernona Clayton statue to go up and interact with it and read about her and learn about her accomplishments. So I really feel like this statue is the future for the depiction of women in Atlanta. Now, there is something to be said about just as the timeline moves on, the closer we get to the present day, it kind of reflects our values more. But there's just something that this speaks to about the way that it allows women to be powerful while also being portrayed in the way that they would like to and the way that they believe best represents their accomplishments. I'm going to hand it over to Jared now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Eris did a walk with me, and I believe I'm remembering right that you told me you'd never noticed the Barbara Asher statue, even though she'd gone past it a lot. So reminds me, I hope that some of these statues that we're mentioning, maybe you haven't noticed them. Zernona Clayton is just up Peachtree Street. Barbara Asher's right over on Marietta. Henry Grady's nearby. We hope you'll go search out some of the things we're talking about. Jared?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jared Shanklin. I am a student here at Georgia State University. I'm a sophomore studying history with a concentration in pre-law. And I'm just happy to be here. I feel right at home because I'm a history major, but also because my 2 certifications are going to be teaching English as a foreign language abroad and then also Espanol. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Today I'm going to be talking about 2 monuments that are here around our campus as well. Definitely want to give a special thanks to Amy and then also to Professor Marnie Davis, who referred me for this. I kind of wrote mine as an open letter of sorts, open speech. So I'm just going to read it verbatim if that's okay for everyone. When I was asked to speak at this symposium, it was a no-brainer. I immediately thought of Rosalind Pope. Last semester in my History 3000 class, our main focus was the civil rights student movement here in Atlanta. And as a Black man raised by conscious parents who made sure my siblings and I knew our history, I walked into that class thinking, I got this. I really already know everything there is to know about Black history. But then I met Rosalind Pope, and my jaw stayed dropped for the rest of the semester. What fascinated me most wasn't just that the movement was there itself, but the women behind it, especially the women of Spelman College, who I wrote about last semester. Women whose names aren't in the textbooks, but whose impact echoes through time. Rosalind Pope was one of those women. In 1960, Rosalind, a Spelman student, penned an appeal for human rights. This wasn't just a letter to the editor. It was a full-on manifesto. A bold, unapologetic declaration of demands for access to education, employment, housing, and dignity. It was published as a full-page ad in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and it shook the city. Governor Van Diver called it anti-American and evil, to which Rosalind Pope said, sounds like I struck a nerve. She was 21 years old. Her bravery lit the match that sparked a student-led movement across Atlanta. Students who staged sit-ins, protests, and freedom rides. And what stands out for me is how Rosalind spoke truth to power without waiting for permission. That kind of courage is timeless. It challenges every student today, myself included, to do the same. If you walk down Sweet Auburn Avenue, you'll see a massive mural of Rosalind, but it's not dark or somber. It's surrounded by pinks, orange, and yellows, and a black and white image of Rosalind stands in the foreground smiling with the words, "The future is bright," behind her. She's wearing her Girl Scouts uniform, a nod to her childhood troop that used to meet in the very building the mural is painted on, the Atlanta Daily World building. The mural doesn't just honor her legacy, it celebrates it. It reminds us that fighting for justice doesn't always have to be sad, doesn't have to always be framed in sorrow. Sometimes resistance wears a smile and a sash. Right down the street is another mural of Ella Baker. Now, Ella wasn't a student, but she was just as crucial to the movement. She'd worked with the NAACP and the SCLC and eventually became the adult advisor to the student movement, the SNCC. But don't let the word advisor fool you. Ella was the movement's backbone. She was known as the godmother of the SNCC. She pushed them to be independent from the older generation of clergy-led leadership and to chart their own course. She famously said, "Strong people don't need strong leaders." That one line flips the script, and it reminds us that real power comes from the collective and not just from one charismatic figure at the top of the pyramid. Ella encouraged SNCC to form 2 wings, one for direct action and one for voter registration. She helped organize the Freedom Rides of 1961. She got students connected with Black sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and regular folks throughout the South. She believed that the most oppressed people, the ones under the heel, had to take the lead and rise up. That kind of grassroots empowerment that still shapes movements today is present all around us. And here's the thing. Before my History 3000 class, I had never heard of either of these women. That's not just a gap in knowledge, but that's a gap in how we tell the history. The stories of women, especially Black women, are too often overlooked, erased, or watered down to footnotes, and yet their fingerprints are everywhere. Rosalind and Ella helped build the movement I thought I already understood, and their names were missing from the stories I thought I already knew. And that realization made me think about the other women, the unsung ones, the ones without murals, the ones whose stories may never make it into a textbook. I'm going to take a moment now and just name some of them here, women who moved my life forward. My mother, Ingrid, my sister, Karis, here on campus, Dr. Shante Earl, who took me on my first Sweet Auburn tour, Miss Pat in the passport office, who helped me get my first passport to study abroad this past semester, Dr. Lauren Fannin, who opened my eyes to Africana studies. They may not have murals on Auburn Avenue, but they're painted across my story in bold, permanent color. Their impact is real and worth honoring. So I want to end with a challenge to everyone here. Think about the Black women in your life, the ones who opened doors, held you down, spoke truth, and made you better. They don't have to be famous. They don't need a quote in the New York Times, but they deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be recognized. Find a way to honor them, whether that's a conversation, a tribute, a thank you, a mural, or maybe just saying their name out loud in spaces like these. I'll leave you with a quote fittingly from Ella Baker. Give light and people will find the way. Let's keep shining the light, especially on the stories that history has tried to hide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jared. And we'll come back to questions at the end. So I want to encourage you to be thinking about what questions you have for these students. And I think focusing on those murals is such a great way to remind us as we continue to think about placemaking. What does our community tell us? How murals in recent years have been this really exciting way to raise up stories that we weren't telling before. And like Jared, I had graduated from Georgia State. I'd never heard of, I had heard of Ella Baker. I had not heard of Rosalind Pope at all. So we'll move on to Heather Meadows Admonson. I keep getting your name confused. Who's a graduate of the MHP program like myself and currently works at Central Atlanta Progress.
Hey, you guys. I am scared of going after these two, but we're going to go on through. Like Amy said, I'm a graduate of the MHP program. I studied public history, nonprofit management, and I had a little time at the National Park Service, and now I work for a nonprofit whose goal is really just to promote downtown Atlanta. And so when thinking about these monuments that I was going to talk about today, I wanted to kind of talk about some that I had kind of recently discovered or noticed, partially because I've been working downtown for the past couple years. And so my theme across all of these is going to be monuments that were erected as part of the 96 Olympics. And so I have to say, I was told I attended the Olympics. I believe I was 2. This will be interesting, right? A lot of the people I work with as well, were really crucial in getting the Olympics here. They did a lot of work in prepping for it. So there's kind of 2 views, I feel like, people who were here and who kind of remember the atmosphere, and then the younger people, right, who knew it happened, but don't really know exactly, Centennial Olympic Park has always been there. It's just the park, right? And so the first one I want to talk about is this one. It's called the 5 Points Monument. And this is something I have to admit I had driven by a million times and never noticed. But then I was recently walking to a work event and I saw it for the first time. And upon looking into it, I realized it was a part of the Olympics. And so just to kind of give some background, so CODA, which is the Corporation of Olympic Development in Atlanta, was a nonprofit that was developed ahead of the Olympics. And their goal was really to not only coordinate and make sure everything worked well, but also make sure that the infrastructure work that they were building for the Olympics extended beyond those 17 days of events. And this is something that has really become important with, large international events like this, is how do we use this interest in our city, in our place, to keep propelling us forward, right? Atlanta already had, in the past 5 or so years, so much interest in all these big developments like Centennial Yards, SoDo, now the center is getting developed. So we had that, and then when that announcement of the World Cup game, that's great. That kind of gave us a deadline, which I'm not going to lie, sometimes we need. And so, how do we take that momentum of the World Cup, for example, and actually make it long lasting? And we can kind of look backwards to the Olympics and see what did we do then that worked, what didn't work. And so this Olympics, actually 96, included an arts festival as well. I encourage you guys, if you were interested, the Atlanta History Center a couple years ago opened a new exhibit on the Olympics, which is phenomenal. So this one right here, as I was talking about, is called 5 Points Monument. It is at 5 Points intersection. And it is an asymmetric interpretation of the water tower that originally stood there. And so it incorporates their traditional girder construction. It also uses some steel trusses that allude to the trolley tracks that used to go here. This was created by George Beasley, who was a Georgia State professor for a very long time, really important in the sculpture studio, I believe. And so, it's supposed to kind of harken back to what 5 Points used to look like. And so you can kind of see on the next slide, there's a couple photos of one of 5 Points and one of another spot in town. So Atlanta used to have great public transit, trying. And, we had all these trolleys that were everywhere, and 5 Points used to look like this, right? It was absolutely bustling with all of this going on. And, then we have Underground Atlanta being built, buried a little bit of that. Of course, the MARTA station coming in there on top as well. All kinds of other developments during urban renewal really changed the landscape of downtown. We can consider White Flight, the suburbs coming up. But that 5 Points monument, right, harkens back to that. And I think that's an interesting piece to consider first, thinking about, it talks about Atlanta's history, right, and what it is now, and that's kind of an interesting contrast. Right now it sits in an island, kind of as Eris was talking about, an island in the middle of 5 Points, already not my favorite place to cross the street. And so you don't really have time to even look at this monument because you are looking at 5 different roads, making sure you're not going to get hit. So something to consider, right? What is the legacy of this? Something we don't really notice, right? So the next one I want to consider is another one that I have only recently really learned about, is Folk Art Park. So this is on a bridge over the connector. It includes art from, I believe, 17 different folk artists from around the state of Georgia. The one that most of y'all might know is St. EOM. That's kind of the most well-known one of those. And so it's on 2 different sides of the road, and it's got these wonderful concrete sculptural folk art pieces. Folk art has a really important history in Georgia. The High Museum has a great folk art, or they call it self-taught art as well. They've got a great collection there. And so this one is meant to share, the story of a larger Georgia, right? The larger art that we see. But I love that center picture of the skyscraper behind it. Once again, this is not the most fun place to walk by, even though you would think, it's super colorful. It seems fun, seems almost like a playground. Kind of when you're standing there, there's a lot of cars. There's a lot of loud cars. The interstate is right below you. There's a lot going on. And again, the intention was great, right? We see these folk artists celebrated, but once again, that placement and Atlanta's kind of fight to be this car-centric city, but also not, is really you can really see it here. This spot is also interesting too. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Stitch, but it is a project to put a park on top of the connector. And so the park will go right here where Folk Art Park is. And right now they are finalizing the master plan. I know a bit more about this. The organization I work for is heading up the development of the Stitch at the moment. I helped to write a walking tour to kind of talk about the history of this area. And they are developing a master plan right now to make sure that the folk art pieces here are incorporated in that future park. And so, again, we're kind of trying to right some wrongs, right, done by urban renewal. And perhaps we can bring some new life to this and tell more people about it, right? Because it's so bright and fun. So this one, I think, stay tuned. There should be some interesting stuff coming up. And the last piece I want to talk about is one that's actually in Centennial Olympic Park. So this is called Tribute. This was done by a Greek artist. So, the Atlanta Games were the Centennial Olympic Games of the modern Olympics. And so this piece shows 3 athletes. One is from ancient Greece. One is from the 1896 Olympics, meant to represent that era. And then one is from representing the 96 Olympics. So it's trying to show the different eras of the games. A really great piece, again, was made by a Greek artist because it was the centennial. This one actually kind of goes more interesting, right? It's not hearkening back to the history of Georgia, to the history of folk art, perhaps. It's talking about the Olympics as its own history, but it kind of got impacted by what happened, right? So as you guys know, there was a bombing in Centennial Olympic Park during the 96 Olympics. It was very close to this statue or this sculpture, and a lot of people actually were able to duck behind it and be saved. But if you guys go look at it, there is an imprint of a nail from the bomb on this piece still. So that's what's in that other picture up top. And so this brings the thought of, they considered, do we fix it or do we not fix it? And they ultimately decided not to fix it, right? What happened to the statue is also a story to tell, right? This was something, very horrific that happened at these games. It is part of those games, right? It's part of the story of it. And so this makes me think of some other monuments, right, that we need to think about. They are important not because they exist, but what happened to them and around them. There's a really good book called Controversial Monuments Memorials. It just had a 2nd edition released, and it's a bunch of short essays about things like this. How do we deal with statues of people like Henry Grady, right, of those? And there's a lot of different, in the public history realm, there's a lot of different ways to think about these, right? Do we leave them and put a plaque next to it? Do we move it somewhere else? Do we move it to a museum? Do we tear it down? Do we put a statue of someone else that was for equality right next to them? And there's so many different ways you can use those, right? And so here, obviously not the same exact thing, but by leaving that imprint of the nail, you are telling another story, right? Not just of the history of the Olympics, the history of this sculpture, but what happened at the 96 Olympics. So these are kind of just 3 examples of interesting pieces that were made because of the Olympics and impacted by them, right? And as we think, right, that organization was made to make sure that infrastructure lasted. Some stuff has lasted, right? Centennial Olympic Park is a lovely green space, but some of these pieces of art, I think, kind of got left behind, right? Maybe the city grew the wrong way around them. And so, as we're looking forward to next year is the 30th anniversary of the Olympics. We have the World Cup coming, of course, too. And the city right now is figuring out, what do we do to celebrate the World Cup? What do we do to make sure that that momentum keeps going forward? And I think it's really important to consider public art. What do we do with public art? I know they are installing a lot of murals, which is really great. They're starting to work on some of them now. But, is there any other large infrastructure thing that we can make and make sure they actually, get appreciated this time around, get seen, make sure they're not in a random pedestrian island? So I think we have a lot of lessons to learn if we look at the legacy of the 96 Olympics and the monuments. And making sure that maybe next year we can do something that serves our community, I think, a little bit better, a little bit more intimately. Yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you, Heather. And I think it's great to bookend this from Henry Grady to the tribute statue, the kind of oldest and I think the newest thing we're looking, well, no, the murals are probably newer, but two statues at very different ends historically, and also that idea of what has happened at these statues as well, and how do we remember that?